A viewer asked about vacuuming or vacuum sealing canning jars in the freeze dryer. And of course, you can put the lid on it, and then I'll just put the ring on loosely to keep it in place, and I could put that in there. If you put a little board shelf in there, you could easily get, probably a dozen jars at a time in there. The problem is, what exactly is that going to gain us? But jars aren't my favorite because they're heavy and breakable and transparent, so they're not the perfect thing for holding stuff long term, months or years. But if you have a light, tight pantry, I suppose it would still be fine if that works for you. But I contend that it's not taking out enough air out of it, and so that you still have a small amount of air in there, which is still 21% oxygen, and is still a lot more oxygen than you would have if you just simply put an oxygen absorber in there. So I think you could do this, I just don't see the point. I think it adds extra time, and you're going to need to run it a long time to get a good vacuum, and you still can't overcome the weight of this lid itself. The air in here has to push that lid up to escape out. So the pressure difference has to be lower than the weight of that, because that lid can hold down that much air. Anyway, that's my contention. Let's test it. The valve is closed, so I'm going to start the vacuum. I'm not going to worry about the freeze. Normally it wouldn't be frozen at this point, I think. So I'm going to start the vacuum. Okay, so we've got the vacuum, the valve is closed, so we're going to go ahead and vacuum. Now, let's see. Well, that brightened up with the dark area. Okay. And again, I don't have the freezer running, so that might affect it a bit. So 2.5 minutes, we're in the 6,000 range. Dropping nicely. 4,000. Almost to 3,000s. Okay, we're below 3,000. So 2,500 right there. It would have been at 252. It would have been below 2,500. So less than 3 minutes. So we're going to keep going till it's at least down to 500. There's just no point on going higher than that, or stopping at a higher point than that. So we'll go to at least 500. And that might take a little while because it wasn't frozen. It's going quite a bit slower right now, and probably part of that is because it wasn't frozen. So it's actually sublimating some of the ice off the chamber from that earlier test. And that would raise the pressure a bit or slow down the drop. So I should have made sure it was dry in there first, or have the cooler running, the freezer. I guess I could turn the freezer on now. I can see the ice disappearing off the walls, which means, of course, it's raising the pressure because of the sublimation. Let's go ahead and start the freezer. Okay, as that starts to cool, that will help, and that will drop faster. And that's just because I didn't have it dry. I should have made sure it was completely dry before I tried this. But we're after a pressure, I'm not going to worry about that. Let's come back and check it. Oh, okay. I don't know how long that took because I went to do a puzzle. Okay, so that dropped nicely once the got cold and stopped sublimating the water out of there, or till it finished. So now we're well below 500. Let's go ahead and stop it. So I'm going to stop the freeze portion. Okay, then I'm going to stop the vacuum. And then I'm going to let the pressure in fairly quickly to help slam that lid down, ideally. At least that's my thought on how that should work. And then we'll be able to see how much air, we'll be able to test it and find out how much air is still in there after doing this method. Okay, I'll put that on there to make sure, you know, and it's got a good vacuum. We'll take it and put it in a container of water upside down, find out how much air is still left in there after doing this. So we've got the jar that we vacuumed. Now I'm going to take the ring part off because that's not needed right now. And then with that still sealed, I'll put it underwater. We'll pry that lid a little bit so that the water will go in. We'll find out how much air was left in there. Because again, 21% of the air that's still in there is oxygen. So we want to have it to be 0, of course. And an oxygen absorber will bring it down to like 1/100% or something. So got that under, give that a little bit of a twist. And I don't even know if you could reuse this lid because it's so hard to get off. Let's see if I can get this. Gotta hold it carefully. Okay, letting the water in, and just make sure that it stays under the water the whole time. All right. So it's a relatively small bubble, but I did have to vacuum it for a very long time. And now we're going to put the lid back on in the ring, so then we can get it out of here and find out how big that bubble is by putting it on a scale and filling it up the rest of the way with water to find out how big that bubble is. And so therefore, how much air is there? And it doesn't take a lot of air to damage your food, or a lot of oxygen. The nitrogen part doesn't matter. Okay, do I have it? Making sure that I keep it under the water the whole time. Get it nice and snug. Okay. So, get that all wiped down. Okay, now we'll find out how much it takes to finish filling that. It obviously won't be very much. Okay, we'll zero that out.
Yeehaw!
Okay, just going till it's level with the top. All right, and it's about 20 grams, or 21 cc's of air, and 1/5 of that, about 21%, is oxygen. So it has about 4 grams of oxygen still in that jar if you use a vacuum method that's that good. And I don't think most kinds are as good as putting it into the chamber. All of them, I think, are going to suffer from part of the same problem, and that's the weight of this lid. The oxygen, here, I'm going to get rid of this before I spill anything. So, let's talk about air. As we saw in that test, by vacuuming this out with the chamber vacuum, the harvest, right, with this in there, and letting it go until the pressure's very low, we still had about 21 cc's of air in here, which equates to about 4.4, close to 4.5 cc's of oxygen in here. Now, the oxygen absorbers are supposed to bring it down to like 0.001, which would be less than 2 or about 2/10 of a cc of oxygen. So exponentially better. Now, The starting point has to be, I think, to understand that vacuums don't suck. The air in here pushes out because the pressure is lower out here when you're in the chamber and putting it under vacuum. So it's not sucking the air out of here. The air in here is pushing out. And one of the wonderful things about the internet is if I'm wrong, people will tell me a lot. If I get something substantially wrong, I'll put it in the pinned comments. But the way I understand how the universe works is that a vacuum pump does not suck the air out. The vacuum pump compresses what air gets in there and then pushes it out. This area in here is going to hold the amount of air that is under this lid. So this lid needs to have a seal around there. It's going to kind of like, I mean, if you imagine it as very pressurized, it's going to pop up and push the air out. Well, it can't push out more than the weight of this lid. So the amount of air in here is going to probably equal this lid at the best case. Anyway, you're going to end up with some air still in here. So even if you vacuum, you're still going to need an oxygen absorber, though it could be a minuscule oxygen absorber. Like I said, there was only about 4.5 cc of oxygen. So if you had a 10 cc oxygen absorber, that would be plenty for this jar if you're using a vacuum. You know, you don't need to use a 100, a 200, 300. You could use a 10, and that's more than double the amount of oxygen that's going to be in that jar if you do that amount of vacuum. But also, how are you going to test to know what vacuum you ended up with? Because you're relying on the fact that you're letting the pressure back in to press that lid down and keep air from getting in. How do you know it worked every time? You can't. You'll know it worked a little bit because the lid's going to pop down. But that doesn't take very much. You could have it half full of air, 3/4 full of air, and that lid's still going to go down. So you're still not going to know the amount of air that was in that jar. So at very least, I would still use a oxygen absorber that's adequate for this size. It'll be overkill because you have vacuumed it, but I don't know, that's kind of rambling on and on. But the point is that just vacuum alone isn't going to be enough because you're still going to leave a lot more oxygen in there than the oxygen absorber would have. If you're comfortable with that, then you could do it that way. So I think the biggest takeaway is that vacuums don't suck, air pushes, and that you're not going to know how much air you have left in there because I'm going to guess every time you do it, it's going to be a little bit different because it's going to depend on how well this seals down there. I mean, if you put a little bit of weight on here, then it would seal better, but it would also hold more air in, so then you defeat the purpose. So I don't know the overall way that you're going to do it and to make sure. I'm not going to rely on the vacuum to take the air out. Even if I were to vacuum, I'm going to assume that there's still air in there and therefore that there's oxygen in there, and I'm going to use the absorber to take care of that.